Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast. I am here, as usual, with Barry Taylor, one of my favorite humans and my fabulous colleague and bestie. And we have a real treat for you today. We have Brien Aadland from the Twin Cities on our podcast. So hello, Barry, of course, always hello, Barry. And hi, Brien. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to have you on. So for those of you who aren't aware, Brien and I go way back. Brien, should I kind of do the 1 minute synopsis of how long we've known each other and how long our stories have sort of intertwined?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, I should have said you do it because I'm trying to pinpoint in my head when we actually met. How many years ago? What was it? Like
Yeah,
12,
we're
15?
yeah, we're dating ourselves. Probably the early 2000s in college. I was
Yeah.
thinking about it today when I was going to be on that at our college, whether we want to name it or not. You were on the sister floor and I was on the brother floor. And I think the first time I met you is we had planned like an outing and we were going to the Twins game and none of the guys on my floor showed up except for me. And then it was you as the RA and like 15 other girls that went to the Twins game. And then and that's when the Twins were terrible and at the Metrodome. And like 2 or 3 innings into the game, all of you girls got up and were like, this is boring, let's go. And and you looked at me and you're like, do you want to go? And I was like, no, I really like baseball and I want to stay. And you were like, okay. So then everyone left and there I was by myself just watching baseball.
Okay.
Abandoned by the sisters.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's like one of my first starting points, but then
Yeah,
I vaguely remember this, and I want to say I was 21 years old. That would have been fall of 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And I was an RA my senior year, and I was given one of the biggest floors on all of campus, 45 women. And they gave me the tiniest men's floor as the brother floor. And I was really pissed. I had no idea who was on it, didn't know you were on it, didn't know the RA who ran it or anything like that. I was just not happy that with 45 women, they gave me like a floor of like 10 dudes. It just didn't sound fun to me. And I'm probably a little,
what's
what?
an RA?
Oh, resident advisor. So like you're basically in charge of keeping the rules and keeping the peace and looking after the
Head
people who live
girl,
on it. What?
like the head girl at a school or something.
Yes. And
Pretty
I had
much.
quite the year as an RA.
Yeah, I'm so shocked that you were the RA.
Yeah.
But
I've got
I'm
very
actually
good
shocked that
story.
you lasted 3 innings at a baseball game.
I'm shocked that Brien remembers I lasted 3 innings. I probably was trying really hard, Brien, to be fair.
I think
that's what
That
baseball's
was probably my max.
I think there's some woundedness there, actually, is what it is.
Yeah, I'm still bitter still at you, Maria, all these years later. I'm still so
Well,
crushed.
you know what? On a public stage, I want to apologize and I want to say thank you for being the dude who came out and hung out with us. And I'm sorry I was lame and took everyone home.
No, that's fine. That's totally fine.
You know,
How many years later? Oh my gosh, from 2021 to 38. Wow. That's crazy. And then we went on to seminary, not together, but at the same time together. We both went to Bethel. And we've just kind of stayed on and off in each other's lives ever since. And we've probably become more friends over the last 3 or 4 years than we were ever at North Central or Bethel or any of the places that we kind of went to together. And there we go. We just kind of named the institutions. But you know, you have quite the story. Like myself, you've kind of been around the block denominationally, in terms of pastoral roles, leadership, just other vocations in life, and kind of where you're at now, a really interesting place. So I'm sort of thinking, do we want to let people know what you're doing now and work backwards, or do we kind of want to start from the beginning? Because one of the coolest things about having someone like you on to tell your story is that our listeners will most likely feel a kindredness with you. They're going to see their story in your story as well. They're going to feel probably less like a mutant, less like, am I the only person that feels this way, or I'm thinking these things, or I'm going through this stuff. And you're one of those really cool people who have kind of walked before a lot of others and a lot of us, and you've sort of lived to tell. And, like most of us, you've come out a little bit bumped and bruised, but you're just at a very, very cool space. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your journey, and we'll just get going.
Cool, thanks. I guess I will start at the beginning and kind of end where I'm at now. It's quite the roller coaster journey. Growing up, I never thought I would be where I'm at currently, but I'm very excited where I'm at currently. So I grew up in the Assemblies of God, good old AG.
Yeah.
Kind of born and bred into that. So grew up there all the way through college, I guess, and then in college, was a pastoral studies major, so I graduated with my BA in pastoral studies and minor in Bible. But pretty much, I would say I started deconstructing, that fun term that everyone likes to throw around, but it was probably more just questioning, doubting certain things. And then I actually had a couple professors who are still in my life. One is Tim Setapeteratna. I just love
Yeah.
his name.
Yeah.
So me and him have been really close throughout the years, all through my journey in school. And he told me, he's like, I think you have what it takes to go to seminary, and I think you're just wanting to learn and critically engage. So then, and I wanted to go to Bethel because I didn't have to do any tests to get into seminary. I kind of wasn't the greatest student in college. Got into Bethel, did the Christian thought degree, which I liked that degree a lot. Probably my favorite one that I did. I didn't like the whole apologetics thing because I think apologetics is, if I can swear on here, bullshit. So
Fair.
did that.
Anarchist.
Loved most of my classes, learned a lot. And that's where I really kind of started asking questions. It's where I met my best friend, Scotty Williams. We were kindred spirits and just started deconstructing everything, like ideas and notions of like hell didn't make sense. That was the first to go out of the way.
And sorry, just to kind of give the timeline for people, because that's still a really popular conversation at the moment, which is surprising, but people are still working on deconstructing things like hell and afterlife and penal substitutionary atonement and things like that. But when was this for you? This was like quite a few years ago.
I kind of joke with some of my family or friends that are still kind of leaving that kind of thinking, or kind of, the popular phrase evangelical. I always joke with them, I started doing that before it was cool and before it was mainstream. I started seminary, my master's degree in 2006 and graduated in 2010. So like 2007, 2008. And kind of what fueled that even more, asking questions, is while I was doing my internship, which was like a really pivotal, I guess, turning point in my life, was I was interning at a church for my AG school that I was at. And at the church where I was interning, was preaching that night, all that stuff, is my dad had a heart attack and died at the church.
Brien, I did not know this.
Yeah. And so that was a really
Sorry,
huge...
can you just pause for a minute? So you were preaching at the church that your father passed away in?
Well, yeah, it was the church I was interning at, so it wasn't my home church. And I luckily was here in the cities where I was interning, and a lot of my relatives, like aunts and uncles, cousins, were there that night. And, all of our schedules aligned. And, my dad had heart issues when he was younger. My dad was a number of years older than me. My parents were 15 years apart. And, when I was about 4 or 5, he had quadruple bypass open heart surgery. Really crazy. He almost died back then when I was 6. But so we were at the church. I was, and that just was such a pivotal moment. And I remember kind of my first time I was actually angry and mad at God is everyone was speaking in tongues, or thought they were speaking in tongues, and praying that he was okay. And I was the one that found him. And what made it even more enraging to me was he had just got done peeing. Like his zipper was still down, everything, and he must have had a heart attack and died. So I knew he was dead. But I remember this time, and it was crazy, was where it was like a lament that I did, when I was pretty much like, fuck you, God. And it was so cathartic. It was so moving for me. And I just, whether it was like a presence of God, the universe, whatever. And that was kind of like a moment where I really started deconstructing a lot of these things that, I was holding on to, because my dad wasn't raised in the Assemblies of God. He was raised Lutheran. So his views and my mom's views were different about a lot of that stuff. But my dad always instilled in me like church and Bible and God, all that stuff's important. And so when he died, then I really started going down this rabbit hole. I mean, I did stupid stuff like abused alcohol and smoked a ton of cigarettes, more than I should. And then I just kind of just went and started researching and studying. And then I realized a lot of the stuff that I started believing as a Christian when I was younger didn't really make sense. And then got graduated college, went into seminary, and then there I just started really deconstructing. As I said a couple minutes ago, hell was the first thing that went out. It never made sense. I came out in support and allyship for the queer community. Had friends from college and high school that were queer, and
Yeah.
I was like one of their first friends that came out as an ally to them. Yeah, and then just I remember in seminary coming out as a universalist, and Scotty having the brunt of that because people thought I was just crazy at this Baptist school that I was a universalist and all that craziness. So, and then right before I graduated with my master's degree, a friend of mine in the seminary there, and when we went to seminary back then, it was really open to different denominations. So you had Catholics and Presbyterians and Lutherans and Baptist people all going there, not anymore. But it was a friend of mine who's actually in the United Church of Christ, the UCC, and he kind of told me, he's like, yeah, you don't fit in here at Bethel. You don't fit in. You're not an evangelical. Uh, I know your story and your background. Why don't you check out the United Church of Christ? My wife and I never heard about it. We were like, what is UCC? And so then we found out about it and fell in love with the church and the community, became members. And then I started the ordination track like a year later and was in there for 8 years until I quit last fall. So that's kind of some of the reasons I quit was control. I just had a huge issue with control, and a lot of nepotism happens inside the UCC, what people don't realize. Thought that was more like an evangelicalism, but no, it's in mainline liberal
Absolutely.
denominations too. And
It's
it
worse.
was, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying sometimes
yeah.
it's even worse in the mainline liberal
Yeah.
denomination. Yeah.
And I'm all about social justice causes, Black Lives Matter. Our church was very open and affirming of the queer community. But I kind of joke and said that it's like, you guys are too woke to be woke. Like they would want to be socially just. So they'd be like, oh, we're open and affirming for the queer community. And then it was like, well, are we going to go to gay pride? Well, not as a church, because we don't want to offend anybody who's not gay. Or like I was on the last kind of nail in the coffin for me is they were like, well, Brien, why aren't you, we're starting this racial justice task force group and we want you to be on it. And I'm like, well, I'm a white guy. I mean, we should have people of color in our church to be on it. And then I looked at them and I was like, oh, wait, we don't have any people that are not white in our church. And then I kind of joked, I was like, and they actually agreed to this. I said, are you asking me to be honest because my wife is mixed race? Because my wife's half white, half Mexican, and my kid is mixed race, and my brother's first wife was Korean, and so I have Korean nieces and a lot of Mexican and Korean in my family. And they were like, yeah, like that's why we're asking you. And you're younger, you're hip to everything happening. And it was like all this stuff that I was seeing that what they were standing for. I was like, I'm just like this token white guy in your church. Yeah. that you just asked me to do this stuff. And then some of the other stuff they just were asking me to do was like, they wanted me to quit my full-time job, how I make a living, how I support for my family, because my wife's a stay-at-home mom. They were like, oh, you just need to quit your job and take out loans to do this other internship, and that's really more important is the ministry and teaching people about God than your your work life. And some of these things I was like, what are you talking about? And then it got to the point where every kind of new ministry that I wanted to try out, I had this thing lined up at my church to try to do like kind of like a service what I'm doing now with Revolution, which I'll get into in a second. But it was just there was like 20 people on a Zoom call last summer, and it was like 20 old white men and women, 60s, 70s, who were just asking me some of the most insane, asinine questions. Oh, what's your view on pastor? What's your view on God? What's your view on this? And nothing that was relevant to the conversation of what I'm going to do. And they were looking at my education. They're like, oh, how, you went to an evangelical seminary. How do we know you're really progressive? How do we really know you're liberal? And it's like, you guys on the screen have seen me in person and talk for 5 or 6 years. And it was all this like bullshit and control where I was just like, I'm done. And
Yeah.
it was the best decision I've ever made.
Yeah. You and I have had conversations about this in your life off record, obviously, off of podcasts. And I've known some of this is why I asked you to be on to tell your story. And every time I hear it, and just hearing it now, I just, unfortunately, it's not the first time I've heard a story like this. I've obviously gone through my own ordination stuff. So has Barry. And it's like something about ordination committees. They're like RoboCop. They're like mall cops.
Yeah.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
They like to feel like they have power, but they don't really. And so they just get caught up in any kind of little bureaucratic nuance that they're allowed to move within. And then they just want to feel their own weird illusion of authority and their own weird like illusion of power. It's why they ask you questions, because they can't actually engage you where you're at in terms of your education, your experience, where your level in life and theology. And so they're just kind of talking over here and the old, same old boring things that they always do. But it's such a bummer. But at the same time, it led you to make a really good decision for your life. I mean, that was 8 years, and I've known you for a long time now. So I remember year after year kind of hearing you talk about, yep, this is where I'm at now in the UCC with the ordination process. And this is where I'm at. And I had to go back, and they sent me back again to do this. They want this of me. And I, remember, and then finally I heard you say, and now I'm just done. And I was like, good. I'm so glad you told them to go fuck off.
Yeah. In a nice about way, I told them to fuck off. And I didn't know this. My wife's very introverted, very quiet. And when I told her I was done, like we went up, one of my favorite places to visit is Duluth, like the North Shore, just good memories up there, just looking at the biggest lake in America. And I remember just saying to my wife up there, like I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And she looked at me. She was like, "That's 8 years too long that you were in there."
Wow.
And what's so funny is, and I'm not just saying this about my church or this denomination. It can happen in any denomination. But there's colleagues in there that I'm still friends with. There's pastors. Like I guest preached at like 4 or 5 different UCC churches in the Twin Cities, and I'm sure I could go and call them up and be like, "Hey, can I preach at your church now?" And they would let me. But it's like all of them treated me in a way like how some of the God did, is they were like, "Oh, well, we still want to be friends. We still want to hang out with you, grab a beer." And as soon as I quit, it's just like they just flew away. They didn't want anything to do with me because
also a familiar story.
yeah. And I just sit back, and I was talking to my wife. I'm like, they're pointing the fingers at the conservatives. Conservatives are pointing the fingers at them, and they're just the same.
Yeah.
And it's in a lot of churches, they feel like, oh, if you want to do ministry, you're nothing unless you're ordained. And I'm like, that whole idea and notion of ordination is just bullshit to me now. It's like I'm allergic to that word.
It is. Barry, I know you were gonna say something just a minute ago.
Well, I don't want to backtrack, but
Okay.
I do think that the problem or the challenge with any denomination is their institutional structures don't move quickly enough, and they also don't reflect quite often their theological perspectives. There's that disconnect between theology, ecclesiology, and authority that gets messed up. It's all well intentioned, but the mechanisms are so dated, and they're so formulaic, and they're quite often just, it doesn't matter, as you both said, it really doesn't matter whether it's an evangelical church or a mainline church. Yeah. They all essentially do the same things in pretty much the same way. They want to know what you believe. They want to make sure that you believe what they think you need to believe, and the mechanism is pretty much the same for all groups, and it's the big failure of I think it's the big failure of the conservative liberal continuum is that, you know, they just don't reflect their theological postures in their leadership structures.
Yeah, absolutely.
So true.
So you said you were done, and when was this exactly? I think you said, but say it again.
Yeah, the end of August of 2020. And then, of course, I had to tell like my advisor and my pastors. And one of my pastors at the church actually broke down and cried over Zoom, which wasn't expecting. But it was, you know, it's probably one of the toughest decisions I've had to make, because like I said, I almost spent 10 years in that process. But then I look back and saw like what they did to me. It was like, in essence, at my church, my home church, I was like an unpaid pastor. I
Sure.
mean, I was, and that's what a lot of churches do, regardless of, like you were saying, Barry, on this liberal and conservative continuum, is they find someone who's passionate, excited, wanting to do ministry, and then they're like, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then they're getting their paycheck, and which is fine. But then I mean, can't tell you how many countless hours I've spent, you know, coming up with sermons or crafting sermons, and then being in these committees and on like just the background, you know, of church life that a lot of people don't realize. And I was like, when I left, I was like, I'm free of this burden. I'm free of just this bullshit. And I just felt like this 100-pound weight lift off my shoulder. And I've been so excited ever since then.
And so, but something really huge happened after that.
Yeah. So I'm sure some people who are familiar with you both know who Jay Baker is. I followed Jay Baker even all the way back when I was a kid, growing up in the AG. And so he was here in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis at Bryant Lake Bowl, which is a bar / bowling alley / theater all in one. And so he was doing Revolution here for like 4 or 5 years. And then because of some family situations, his kids were being moved out to Seattle. So him and Caleb, who, you know, you guys both know well.
Yeah.
So they moved out to Seattle. And I was like, hey, Jay, like, I want to take Revolution over. Is that okay? And he's like, yeah, like the one that was just here in Minneapolis. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, you and Caleb have created this great thing, and I know why you have to move. So move. But I said, I don't want this community here, even though it's small, to die. So he's like, yeah, like he knows me really well. He knows I'm seminary trained, and I told him I just quit within the UCC. And so he's like, yeah, I wouldn't want anybody else to take that besides you. And so there I started it, you know, back in November of last year. And it's kind of weird just doing it on, you know, Facebook Live for like 3 or 4 months. But then back in March, Bryant Lake Bowl, I made a deal with them, and we're back there, and it's growing. Some weeks are better than others. Now it's in the summertime in Minnesota, so no one ever goes to church in the summertime.
Why would you, when you be brunching with bottomless mimosas? That's what I always say.
Yeah, and it's so fun telling people that, like,
Cafe.
I don't even like the term pastor, but I'm like, yeah, I'm a pastor of a church. They're like, oh, cool, where do you meet? I'm like, in a bar. They're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I meet in a bar, and I'll have like a beer while I'm talking, and you know, all this stuff. And they're like, oh, that's really cool. Which it's like, I think people have been doing that for a long time. Maybe they didn't think it was church. So that's what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
And I'm just, you know, it's so free where I don't have to be like, oh, is someone from the church or ordination staff looking over my shoulder? And it's just, you know, it's free. I have a small little group of people from the church that keep me, you know, accountable, that I don't just speak heresy, which I can pretty much say whatever I want, I guess. So yeah, and the one thing I always tell people is we're like the sister church of Revolution, of like Jay's Revolution, but I can keep the name, I can change it, but I'm kind of just doing my own thing. So if we get money or donations, that stays to us, and if they donate to them, like, we're completely autonomous from one another. So
Yeah, that's so interesting, you know, because a lot of times when you have a church like Jay's church, it was a very small community, but
Yeah.
his name really means something in that kind of community setting. And so if he's leaving to go start a community somewhere else, it's really anybody's guess how the community that's being left is going to fare. Usually it doesn't go really well, but in this case, you've really stepped up in terms of leadership. And really, I remember talking to you about this several months ago in the beginning of the whole venture, and I just loved hearing your heart. You were very pastoral, you were very gentle, you were very tender, and you were just really you had this peaceful kind of calm presence about it. This is what we're doing. We're going to give it a shot. It's in the middle of the pandemic, but we're just going to, keep moving forward. And you've just been really steady, which I think is amazing, because I think after a story like yours, where, you've gone through the craziness of the AG, you had, that moment of your father dying and kind of, fuck you, God, and then moving to the liberal side of the spectrum and doing the UCC thing, getting just bashed again and just hurt again, where, now you're saying fuck you to someone else, on that whole spec, and then kind of moving into Jay's church. And the interesting thing about you, and why I wanted you to share your story, is because even though you have this really scathing and at times just painful story to share, you've come out of it somehow with really a heart of flesh still, where you could really have just been turned to stone. And I think so many people, and I know Barry hates it, I know you don't love it, I don't love it, but for lack of a better term, so many people who are going through deconstruction, it's a really gentle balance of, engaging the anger and the hurt and the bitterness, and also moving on to new horizons and new hope and new life. And that is always the rub. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, you have just always ever seemed really beautiful and really hopeful and really calm, and just kind of taking it all in your stride. And where a lot of people are taking things in the teeth, you take it on the chin. And I just really, really appreciate that about you. And I think that's what makes your story different, and one that I wanted to be told on Sacred Anarchies.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the kind words. And one thing I love about just the whole kind of revolution community, Jay's and now ours, is, just a plethora of different, voices. We have queer people, we have theistic people, atheistic people, agnostic people, and we all just come there. It's not even about Jesus or the scriptures. It's just about let's be in a community with one another. And if I get really Jesus-y in a sermon, or if there was one sermon where, obviously everything here in the Twin Cities with George Floyd, during the whole court trial here a couple months ago, I had a sermon. It said, "Stop killing unarmed Black people," and it got a lot of views. And I was super passionate and crying through it, and just because, so I don't have to stick to a script,
No.
or trying to prove a point, or oh, I have to stay in this ordinational, or denominational bubble. So it was really and it was just really freeing. But then I will say this, to kind of to finish the story where I'm at now, is, and this is fine on this podcast, but I know none of my family listens to it, but I was with some family this weekend, my wife, and then a brother and sister-in-law, and they're really, they kind of deconstructed their faith from how they were raised. And we were just talking just really about deep stuff. One of my in-laws was raised in a church, and now is trying to understand witchcraft, which was something I never thought. I was like, oh, cool, you do you. And the more we were just talking, and my wife and I were talking, is I just had this clarity moment where I was like, I think I'm agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's a huge swath. And I said to my wife, because it was my wife and a couple of my in-laws in the room, I said, I love Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, and I think that's why they've transcended kind of time and space and culture. But I said, if I'm really honest with myself, and I can go all the way back to high school and college, I was like, did I ever really believe all this? you know, it was kind of this, like, I was coming out of my shell even more. I was like, do I really believe in all this? Like, so I always maybe kind of theologically would be like weak agnosticism, because there's like weak agnosticism and hard agnosticism. So I would say I'm more like in the weak agnosticism, where I'm like, yeah, Jesus or God could be real, but God could not be real either. And I'm just gonna live my life still liking and trying to inhabit or mimic the teachings of Jesus, but I don't know if there's a reality after this. I don't know, you know, we could go to heaven, we could just be in the ground for the rest of how long the planet's here. And it's very freeing. It's very freeing to kind of have that mentality and attitude. And like I said, like I felt more peace, just like inner peace. I feel more connected almost to like nature and the universe. And it's also awesome that I have a spouse who's completely 100% supportive of me, because I was scared to tell her, because I'm like, oh, you still identify as a Christian? Like, are you okay that I'm more agnostic? She's like, yeah, like you do you. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I know it's kind of all over the place, but it's just like this trajectory at where I'm at, and I just can't, you know, be. And maybe some of it was how I was treated in the church and denominationally, but you know, we're all in our journey and we all got to find, you know, our meaning and our peace. And right now I'm the most peaceful as I have ever been, and it's frankly without church.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, I think, um, especially when you come from where you came from, you know, with Assemblies of God, which have, you know, they have very strong opinions about things of which we can't really be certain. It's all conjecture, but it's
Mhm.
presented as absolute and, you know, authority, you know, and the information that you need to know. And I think coming to terms with uncertainty and undecidability and being open to what emerges now and not worry, because those, you know, all those things about the afterlife, heaven, hell, what they're all just ideas by which we try and explain the bit of reality we can't get our heads around. You know,
Right.
you can't imagine that non-being is nothingness.
Mhm.
So consequently, and it's not just Christians that do it. I mean, most religions have a very fixed view of what happens when you die, and it's one of the mechanisms that gives people or has given people comfort. But I think in this day and age, that's less of a comfort because it's more problematic for people these days to kind of embrace the idea that someone can know. And you know, there are so many competing voices: scientific voices, neurological voices,
Mhm.
voice consciousness, and all that stuff. So, you know, I don't even know if you need to call yourself anything other than just someone moving through life.
Right, right. The only reason I always tell my wife I hate titles and labels, but yet humans, we love labels. Even people like myself are like, oh, I don't like labels, but I'm like, I have to label myself something so people understand at what part of life I'm at. Like, I don't say I have to have that label, but other people would be like, so what are you? Or, you know, where do you identify as? And so it makes sense for me now. But like I said, it's probably a lot of how of the things that happened to me in my life and trajectory. But it's just the more I was talking to my wife and friends, it was just like stuff with the Bible and stories and all these theological doctrine and dogmas. I'm like, I don't buy any of it.
Yeah.
I just don't. And finally being, you know, almost I'll be 38 in a few months. And it's like at almost 40 years old, it's freeing to finally come to that conclusion of being like, this might be all that we have in this life. Because growing up in the church, it was like, this world's not our home, we're passing through it, you know, like this world is just a blip. And now I look at it as I'm like, I love this life, you know, even the ups and downs, the suffering I had to go through with losing a parent, like that's just part of life, you know. And so I'm trying to live every moment that I have with my family and with my daughter and just my job and friends, just trying to find the beauty in that. And right now it's very, very beautiful to me.
Yeah, I love that. I
It's a
love
good
that.
end.
And Yeah, I think that all the conversations that we've had, and certainly we would agree that is our own experience, that when we move from the confines of traditional notions of religion, Christianity, theism, all of these things, dogma, doctrine, ideology, that we have never felt more peace, that we have never felt better about life and being alive and what it might mean to be human in the world and to make meaning and to pursue life and beauty and all of those things. We've never felt more of that until we felt released from a lot of this stuff and really just, sank our teeth into life here and now. And I know a lot of people feel that way. So I just love what you said. I think it's really, really beautiful. And like Barry said, I think that's probably a really good and hopeful note to end your story on. But this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much. You shared so much, and you were so vulnerable, and you shared things that I didn't even really know still after all this time of being friends. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and baseball has.
Thanks for having me on, everyone.
What was that? Both of you said something at the same time.
Go ahead, Brien.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
He's breaking up a little bit. We're missing him. All right. Brien, hang on a minute. I'll end the podcast and then we'll say proper goodbye. Thanks so much, everyone. And we will see you again soon on Sacred Anarchies. Bye.
Bye.